James Oroc is the author of many fiction and non-fiction books, essays and articles on the subject of psychedelics. He is also the culture curator of dmtsite.com, and he's the author of the book Tryptamine Palace, for which he was already here at the Boom Festival in 2010. In his talk, he will attempt to frame the goals, the intentions and the needs of contemporary psychedelic culture, and why its appliance at this time in history is so important. Please welcome James Oroc with his lecture, The Second Psychedelic Revolution, Reflections on the Reemergence of the Psychedelic Culture.
Thank you very much. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Awesome. Hey, it's really exciting to be back here at Boom. You guys are at one of the nexuses of psychedelic culture, and these speaker series and places like this, I think, are extremely critical to the growth and development of this culture. So thank you very much for attending on this hot Boom afternoon. This is actually a new presentation for me. You guys are the first ones that are really going to get it. I did a similar version at Alex Gray's 60th birthday at COSM when the Grays invited me up there. And that spun into a 6-part series that I wrote for Reality Sandwich, which is now spun into a book. It's my new book by the same title. Hopefully it's going to have a cover like this. It's some work of Luke Brown, one of my favourite visionary artists whose work's in the gallery. And we start this story in the year 2000 with the infamous Kansas silo LSD bust. I don't know how many of you guys know about this, but the DEA, through the information of one of the chemists who basically just wigged out, they had no idea that this lab existed, managed to bust this LSD silo that was supposedly the last of the Brotherhood of Love chemists. This gentleman, William Picard, who's actually a doctor and is now serving life without parole for, they never even found any LSD. He's serving life without parole for being able to create the LSD. There's a lot of controversy about this bust, but what resulted in it was a massive drop in the world's supply of LSD. Between 2000 and 2005, the amount of LSD that was available dropped by something like 95%, especially in the United States, where it really looked like for a moment LSD was about to disappear. Now, the reason that this lab was important is that the Brotherhood of Love were a group of surfers who were hashish smugglers who believed that LSD was the way they were going to change the world. And it was because of the Brotherhood of Love that the price of LSD stayed so very low for so very long, because they really didn't believe in making a profit of it. They tried to keep the price as low as they could. The two chemists that were mostly responsible for that were these gentlemen, Tim Scully and Nick Sand. I know later in the week they've actually got the movie The Sunshine Makers is going to be on here. So I check you guys check that out. It's a fascinating story. And these guys created the recipe for Orange Sunshine LSD, which was the first LSD that wasn't made by a company like Sandoz. And they were responsible for making some 75% of the world's acid. Nick disappeared and was underground until 1998. He was busted in Canada with a huge lab. He's recently, not a few years ago, he's out and around. He's an amazing old guy. But with the drop of acid in 2000, and around the same time as the deaths of these two gentlemen, Timothy Leary, Dr. Timothy Leary, who was responsible for the propaganda, you might say, of the 60s and the spread of LSD, and Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, who are the ones that invented the acid tests. Now, I don't know what you guys know about the acid tests, but in the 60s, when LSD was still legal, Kesey and his group created the first multi-sensory music, art, light extravaganzas where the whole audience was encouraged to take large amounts of LSD and have an experience, the acid test. So what we have here at Boom and Burning Man and the Grateful Dead and everything very much spun off from the experiment of really a handful of people in the mid-60s. The house band at the original acid test was a band called the Warlocks, who became much better known as the Grateful Dead. And the Grateful Dead were the ones that were really responsible for LSD remaining in circulation all the way into the 90s. Now, the 1980s, statistically, was the lowest period for psychedelic use in history. When we got into the greed culture of the 80s, that was very cocaine-driven, psychedelics were looked down upon. You were kind of a loser if you were a tripper in the 80s. And it wasn't until the 90s that things started to turn around again. But in the year 2000, at the time of the acid bust, you could have almost said that the original 1960s LSD rock revolution was over. Larry's ashes were in space. Ken Kesey died a year after the Kansas silo bust. Acid was suddenly disappearing. If you were the DEA from the outside, it looked like you had won, that the psychedelic culture had been crushed. But actually, something quite remarkable happened, and we've experienced a renaissance in psychedelic culture. And it's interesting to me that what really happened with the prohibition of LSD is it's led to a diversification of compounds and other parts of the psychedelic culture. So in my book, I've narrowed this down to 3 books and 3 architects of what I call the second psychedelic revolution that all came out in the early 90s. Between 1990 and 93, we kind of see the blueprint being put together for the contemporary psychedelic culture that we now occupy. The first and most important of these books is PACAL, which stands for Phentyl means I have known and loved, and was followed by a book 3 years later called TCAL, which is tryptamines I have known and loved. That's the work of this man, Alexander Sasha Shulgin, who's probably best known in this audience as being the repopularizer of MDMA. He didn't invent it, but he is the one that brought it back into contemporary culture. Sasha also invented some 290 psychedelic compounds in this tiny little lab that is no bigger than a garden shed. And if there's ever a shrine on this planet for psychedelics, it really probably should be this little spot in California. So Sasha was a very interesting man. He worked with the DEA. He's actually the one that wrote the manual for the DEA about all their drugs. But he obviously had a real libertarian streak to him, and he didn't want to see his work being buried. So he made the very brave move of publishing PACAL, which is an interesting book because not only does it describe the compounds that he's invented, but it also has the formulas in it. So for a competent chemist, everything they need to know is in PACAL and TCAL. In a number of countries, these books are illegal, but the publishing of these books, and indeed the rise of contemporary psychedelic culture, very much coincided with the birth and spread of the World Wide Web. So when Sasha put PACAL out, and he was actually, the DEA raided him after he even though he was the government expert on psychedelics, he got busted by the DEA for some drugs that they had sent him. And he got a $25,000 fine for samples they found lying around his lab, but they never really managed to stop him. So now the entire contents of PACAL and TCAL are online, so chemists all over the world have access to this information. And I think we can't underestimate how important the internet has been to the spread of this new psychedelic culture, whether it's through the art or through the music or through just straight, uncensored information, which is a new era we're living in. The second most important architect of our new psychedelic culture was this man, Terence McKenna, who's well known in this culture through his early association with this music and once again the internet. And the 2 books he wrote, Food of the Gods, which is mostly about mushrooms, and another book called The Archaic Revival, whose cover just you could hardly see when I put it up. Terence's main focus were magic mushrooms, but he's also very much responsible for our current interest in ayahuasca and DMT. Before Terence's books, DMT had pretty much disappeared. This is one of the interesting things to me about the prohibition of LSD, is when we went through this, I mean, in 2003 at Burning Man, there were literally 4 vials of LSD going around the entire encampment, and they were being tracked. Like, I was with the Psytrance crew, so they knew where they were, you know. It was just crazy. It really looked like acid was about to disappear. And that was when we had a sudden wave of 2CB that appeared largely in this era. Ayahuasca and the interest in mescaline and ayahuasca rose greatly. And DMT really came on in full force, because for the first time you had simple extraction recipes that were also published online. So anybody in this audience is totally capable of making their own DMT. All you need some mason jars and some solvents and a supply of Mimosa hostilis. It's really not that hard. So Terence had a massive effect, I think, in this culture, where he laid out the blueprint for a lot of the new compounds, and he also gave us this idea of this archaic revival. A lot of the fashions, there's Terence's house in the Big Island where he died. And he also died in the same period as the other two. It was really a massive loss to psychedelic culture, the early 2000s. But even like the current tribal fashion has a lot to do with Terence's call for this archaic revival, and a lot of the themes of shamanism and a lot of the themes that have now become so commonly integrated into contemporary psychedelic culture come from Terence. The third member of this architects of our new contemporary psychedelic culture was Alex Gray. And the release of this book, The Sacred Mirrors, in 1993, which has gone on to sell almost 200,000 copies and has been translated into something like 14 languages. For me, Alex is a philosopher who paints. His early art especially has an ability to transmit the years of study and meditation and different things that he personally went, and somehow it's like the best of the Tibetan art or different religious art that actually gives almost a transmission of knowledge. You don't need to know all the things that Alex learned to go into the artwork. You look at the artwork and there's a transmission that comes with it. To me, that's really been a large part of his success. Here he is, hard at work. And he, in this title, The Visionary Art of Alex Gray, his editor at Inner Traditions chose a quote from William Blake, Blake used the term, who was the one that the doors of perception, the famous quote that if the doors were wiped clean, everything would appear as it is infinite. Blake didn't use psychedelics, but he's had a huge influence on psychedelic culture. And co-opting this term visionary to describe Alex's art has now resulted in psychedelic art has very much become known as visionary art. And in some ways, psychedelic culture is becoming known as visionary culture. This is a little bit of a coding that makes it easier for this art and these festivals to go on in the real world, because there is a certain danger to using the word psychedelic in anything these days, where if you have an entheogenic conference or a visionary art show, you're a lot safer. But I think it also shows that our concept of how we use psychedelics and what we want to use psychedelics for is deepening. And I would say, that's probably another big difference for the second psychedelic revolution, is we have the mistakes from the 60s to learn off. And so as we go on, we're creating more of a culture. And this gets spread out in things like the Bicycle Day celebrations that we have every year in San Francisco, which is a nexus of art and music, Boom, Burning Man, such things. This is Entheon Hall, which is the Gray's exciting first building that's going up at COSM. It's supposed to open next year. Alex has definitely become more of a sculptor these days. Here's me and the boss, as I call him, at the recent MAPS conference. And now we have the new Visionary Art Tribe. This is Boom in 2010. I shot a photo of this panel, and it's quite funny looking back historically. You got running from right to left, right to left, Android Jones, Amanda Sage, Luke Brown, Adam Scott Miller, Carrie Thompson, Zavi, and Carr. Andrew and Carrie are the two art directors here at Boom and responsible for much of what you see. And this core group's really had a lot to do with the spread of visionary art over the last decade due to their enthusiasm, and they're really hard workers, these guys. They're everywhere. They're very serious about what they do. The nexus of this was from Boom in 2010. We did a camp at Burning Man called Fractal Nation that was also involved the people here from Boom. And it was like a mini festival that went on in the middle of Burning Man. We had Lucent Dossier. All right, hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself here now. And what we tried to do at Fractal, and what I think is what they try to do here at Boom and other such places, is we're really trying to present psychedelic culture in a positive way. Like at Fractal, I always felt what we're saying, this is what the world would be like if you just let psychedelics be and let them have their influence on society and let society bloom. You know, and I think that's what we're trying to do at gatherings like this, is put really the most positive face on psychedelic culture and just show people how beautiful psychedelic culture can really be. This last Bicycle Day party in San Francisco was particularly memorable for me, for the crowd was amazing and the music, everything about it was just really at a very, very high level. And I had dinner with Alex and Alison Gray the next night, and I was like, it must be lovely being venerated, you know, everybody loves you and you're on stage and there's all these people, but what's it like when you look out and the whole crowd looked like last night? You know, the crowd was amazing. And Alison said to me, she said, psychedelic culture is the hippest thing going on at the moment. It's really like, it is, especially in the United States, psychedelic culture is really becoming the in thing. The interest in microdosing and the Silicon Valley aspect, and that's really moving psychedelic culture from the fringes into kind of a mainstreaming, which is interesting to me. So this is what I say is the basis of our new second psychedelic revolution. Just to recap. The introduction of a wide number of new psychedelic compounds, especially the 2C family. The widespread rediscovery of sacred natural plant entheogens, especially ayahuasca, and the publication of simple methods of extracting DMT from plants. The emergence of psychedelic trance music, which integrated sacred chanting and rhythms from various cultures with non-stop repetitive acid house beats. Please, my apologies to all my DJ friends for that massive simplification right there. This is the first what's interesting is this is the first musical genre to openly venerate psychedelics since the 60s. The birth of visionary art, an often deliberately sacred form of psychedelic art, and its 2-decade-old integration into contemporary psychedelic culture, especially at Burning Man at Boom. Now this is something that's really interesting to me. Without the art, these festivals would not really be able to exist. Like, the art has become a very important part of the overall experience because the DJ himself doesn't have the same kind of visual stimulus that a band had. I'm a big live music guy. I live in New Orleans, so I get to see a lot of bands. And I think the one thing you really notice with DJs is it's a very different interaction. And indeed, in Azora, we just had some panels, and some of the old Goa trance guys were a bit contemptuous of the fact that the DJ's now up on the stage and he's back in the center. They said the whole point of the early Goa dance parties was to remove the DJ and get him away so you didn't have that distraction anymore. I think that's an interesting point. The early acid tests were that way too, and the early Burning Man was that way. It was a much more anarchistic, sort of everybody's equal, socialistic kind of approach to the experience. Now as it becomes more and more festivalized, we're getting back into this atmosphere with the star in the center of the stage. But often at these festivals, I think the big star is the art. And it's without the art, the culture would have had a hard time growing to where it's at. So all of these different streams all arrived at the same time. And the other two big things that happened in the early 90s was the first Goa trance parties left India and started to turn up in England and Europe, and Burning Man in the United States moved to the desert. So these two nexuses had a huge effect on creating environments for this culture to grow. We also have the vital role of the emergence of the internet, which allows for the uncensored global sharing of psychedelic culture. And we have this mainstreaming of psychedelic culture. Now, what do I mean by the mainstreaming of psychedelic culture? Well, for a start, we have organizations like MAPS, and there's a number of other ones, but I'll just throwing this one up, which is, concentrates on the sciences of the psychedelic sciences. And it's run by the guy in the States called Rick Doblin, who's really done an amazing job of bringing the discussion of psychedelics as medicines back into the contemporary conversation. And the first MAPS conference a decade ago was all about what everybody wanted to do. There was really very little actual research that anybody could produce that was being done. The last MAPS conference was full of research going on all over the world, and different things. There's a lot of stuff, end of life, and the big one that I think is going to be the breakthrough in the United States is MAPS, by probably 2020, is going to see MDMA recognized as a legal medicine. Mostly they got trials going on for the PTSD, for the enormous number of American servicemen returning from their wars who are shattered and unable to reintegrate into society. And MDMA is proving to be very effective. At the recent MAPS dinner, which was the big one a few months ago, they had an actual soldier get up and talk. And it was the most interesting part of the night for me. He said he doesn't know a single one of his friends who's come back from Iraq that's gotten back to baseline. Everybody's below where they were. Nobody's gotten back to where they were. He said that MDMA therapy not only got him back to baseline, but has actually got him above it. That he feels like he's actually growing again as a human being, and that he's managed to put Iraq behind him, and he can move on. And he just wants to see these medicines available for his friends. And it was a very compelling argument towards the use of it. I know a lot of us think, well, you shouldn't have gone to Iraq to fight in the first place, or Afghanistan. And I think we have to realize, especially in countries like America, there are a lot of very poor, uneducated kids get dragged into the military really young. And often it's the only choice they've got for another kind of life. A lot of people signed up, in forces thinking they were going to get educations out of it. So there's been a lot of damage done. In the 20th century, there's been an unbelievable amount of damage done to the youth. MAPS also managing to introduce cosmic care type programs in the States. America's a very strange place. I've lived there for a long time. I'm from New Zealand originally. There's more psychedelics obviously available in America or anywhere else, but at the same time they have the strongest laws against them. There's kind of this reverse psychology. There's a law in America called the Rave Act, and it basically states if you throw a festival that seems to be promoting psychedelics or any drugs, you can then be prosecuted as a drug dealer yourself. They're saying that you are creating an environment conducive to the sale of drugs. So on the West Coast, where originally at festivals like Lightning in a Bottle and Symbiosis I was quite popular, I now have a hard time getting a gig because they're afraid they're going to get prosecuted under the Rave Act by having me step up and try and give good solid information. And the cosmic care and the drug testing and the things that you've got going on here at Boom are very underground. This was the first one that ever actually managed to be held. It was also at our camp Fractal. And this is all manned, as I believe the cosmic care is by here. They've got proper, health professionals who are interested in psychedelics working. Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs' autobiography, I think, is probably the biggest thing that's broken psychedelics and acid into the mainstream in the last few years. And this was this particular statement. Taking LSD was one of the most profound experiences of my life. LSD shows you that there's another side to the coin, and you can't remember it when it wears off, but you know it. It reinforced my sense of what was important, creating great things instead of making money, putting things back into the stream of history and of human consciousness as much as I could. Steve Jobs. He managed to make a few dollars along the way, but it was interesting, when he talks about hiring you at Apple, he wouldn't hire you if you hadn't done acid. He thought you couldn't think laterally, that he wanted the people that were thinking out of the box. And I think, it's like Niels Bohr, the great physicist, says about scientific revolutions. You never win the old school over, they just die off. And that's what we've got going on. There was enough people that lived through the 60s and have now gone through all this, and slowly but slowly the old school are dying off, but the new school are starting to realize that there's something else. So the big question for me at this point is, well, why are psychedelics re-emerging in our society? Is there a point to all this? Like, they've been very persuasive, they don't want to go away. And I've been trying to get an accurate idea of how many people have actually taken psychedelics or annually take psychedelics, because it's a hard number to get a number on. It seems to me from my research, somewhere around 27 to 30 million people worldwide, not counting tribal cultures, but actual modern psychedelic. We're at about 30 million people, which is not really that many when you think about it. But if you look at the American population, of being some, let's say 25 million Americans have taken LSD by now, you're getting close to this 10% number. In special development, they've discovered that it's actually 5% of any species actually dictates the evolution and direction of that species. So as part of my thinking is, I think we're trying to reach this critical mass where enough people actually are converted to a psychedelic mindscape that we start to change society as a whole. Now, I think in the 60s, LSD was so powerful, they thought that could just do it overnight, that if they just got everybody to drop acid, things would change. And I think maybe one of the things we are realizing is it's not just the drugs that makes the change, or the psychedelic compounds. You still have to work with the information that you're given, and you have to be very aware. One of the things I find interesting about LSD is it tears down the ego, but then the ego rebuilds up stronger around it. And I think you can see from the 60s a number of the large, guys like Leary and Ken Kesey and these guys actually had massive ego blowouts. Like, they didn't really recognize that. And one thing I would definitely encourage everybody is to take breaks in your psychedelic use and actually, integrate the information you're receiving, and don't just keep thinking, oh, well, I'll do another ayahuasca trip or I'll do another acid trip and I'll get another download. Because I don't think it really works like that. I think there's a certain amount of integration that needs to go on. And anybody that's interested in the role of the ego, I thoroughly recommend Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth, which has no mention of psychedelics in it at all, but is a non-denominational breakdown of how he thinks this thing called the ego works in us. And I think if you have a psychedelic perspective, a lot of what he says makes a lot of sense. In my new book, there's an essay called What Entheogens Can Teach Us, because the thing I'm most interested in is practical aspects of entheogen psychedelic use. So I said, in history, I hate the word drugs. That's just a basket term that they throw all these very different compounds in, and then they use this term to control them all. We should really be much more, and our own society, our own culture does that. All drugs are not good, I don't think. Just because something's a drug or it's illegal, or we should be very much more discerning of what we use, how we use it, and the social cost of where it's coming from. MDMA, for example, which is very popular and a lot of people love, has quite a tremendous social cost at the moment. In Borneo and in China, there's massive deforestation going on and large ecological damage because they need the saffrole from the saffrole trees that's the base for MDMA. You don't hear a lot of talk about this, but MDMA is actually creating quite a lot of damage around the planet. Cocaine's the most obvious one. The social damage for cocaine is tremendous. Drugs like LSD and mushrooms and things seem to have had the opposite effect. There's very little social damage being caused by the production, sale, or distribution of these things. So I think it's interesting to look at the structures that build up around certain compounds. Marijuana is another interesting one. People do huge deals on handshakes, and it always seems to work out. You don't hear of a lot of bad stuff attached to the cannabis industry. I think certain drugs have a certain aura and create these structures around them. So this quote's from a book called Small is Beautiful in 1973 by a British coal economist called E.F. Schumacher that was extremely popular at the time and has somewhat fallen out of view. But I think it's an incredibly important book. Its subtitle is Economics as if People Mattered. And it's based on the idea of a village economics, and a lot of these theories he applied in India. And there are Schumacher organizations still present all over the world. But he says, I have no doubt that the task of our generation is one of metaphysical reconstruction, which means we've lost our sense of the holy and spirit in the world, and now we as a culture are attempting to find that again. And I think that's a large part of why psychedelics are re-entering our society. As psychedelics is a way for source, spirit, God, whatever you want to call it, to reach out to us all on an individual level and help bring about this experience of transcendence. Joseph Campbell said the easiest or the most ancient and known methods of transcendence are music and dance. And I think when you integrate psychedelics into that equation, that obviously helps. This was a quote I found recently that I think explains a lot, I really like. I have suggested that if their sale were legalized, the popularity of these psychedelic drugs would be limited. Their widespread use, which I think is feared, could indeed prove a threat to the continued expansion of modern industry. If new opportunities were extended to individuals for strange and exhilarating explorations into the mysterious universe and the mysterious self, the markets for media entertainment, for packaged tourism, and for all the modern accessories of commercial hedonism would surely diminish. And if the popularity of such psychedelic drugs were to have any perceptible and enduring effects, they would certainly involve the curtailing of economic growth. For they do tend to shift the individual's interest from the search for ways of keeping up with the machine towards the search for meaning and purpose. Finally, in our technocratic civilization, in which adjustment to the machine entails becoming like the machine, the hallucinogenic experience is one of releasing, for a while, the faltering human spirit trapped inside the machine. And I really think that this quote by R.J. Mishan hits it on the head, that, you know, the re-emergence of a psychedelic culture at the end of the 20th century, as there's been an explosion in consumerism and an acceleration in the way we're depleting the planet, is not an accident. These things are balancing forces. In my essay, What Can Entheogens Teach Us, when I'm talking about drugs, I say, okay, let's make a scale. And let's put all the drugs, well, let's put at the top of the scale the drugs that most dissipate the ego, and we'll put at the bottom of the scale the drugs that most reinforce the ego. So at the top of your scale, it's pretty simple. It goes 5-MeO-DMT, DMT, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline. You're into the empathogens, ketamine, marijuana, heroin, and then the bad end, you get into the methamphetamines, cocaine, and alcohol. 5-MeO-DMT is universally regarded as being the compound that most disassociates the sense of ego. If you have a successful release experience on 5-methoxy-DMT, you should experience the experience of consciousness without identity, which was, for me, my second psychedelic revolution. I thought I knew all about psychedelics till I smoked 5-MeO-DMT, and I realized I didn't know anything. And it was this experience of being consciousness, but no idea no identity attached to it at all. Pure consciousness. It was such an amazing experience. And as soon as you start to think, oh, how did this happen, and how long's it been going on, and who am I? That's when you start to get being rebuilt, and suddenly you're back on the ground. The ego's reintroduced itself. People often ask me, you know, how do I like to smoke 5-MeO-DMT, and I smoke it alone, personally, because if there is anybody else around me, when I come out of the experience, I latch onto them, and I try and rebuild myself on shared experiences with these people. If they're not in the room, I can actually lie in the state in between universal consciousness and my own consciousness and be aware of it and a little more integrated. And I've been getting better and better at holding that space. But if there's anybody else in the room, I'm immediately latching on to the shared experience. And another thing I find fascinating is Whenever I smoke it by myself, I always come to in exactly the same spot. It's a 20 to 30 minute experience. You're completely out of body, and you really have no idea of what's going on with your meat or the meat as I call it, while your brain's off doing its own thing. So, and I've often had friends want to video it, and I'm like, no, I don't want to see what my meat's up to when I'm away. But the interesting thing is, if I do it with anybody else around, I get very active. I get up and I walk around and I wander around in my house and roll around like a baby and put my feet up on the wall. And people tell me all these crazy things I do. But whenever I smoke it myself, I always end up back in exactly the same spot. Nothing looks disturbed. It doesn't look like I've moved. So I think that's maybe got something to do with the other energies in the room as well. Anyway, so going back to the scale, I'm off track. So we start at the top with the compounds that disassociate the ego, and we go to the ones that reinforce them. Cocaine is a classic ego reinforcer. The me drug. A bunch of people stand around talking about themselves, not listening to each other. And then alcohol is, it's such an ego reinforcer, you'll get in a fight over you because you think your idea is so important, you'll punch somebody, Now, the interesting thing is if you look at that scale, there's a direct relation to toxicity. So the drugs at the top of the scale are the least toxic. 5-MeO and DMT are actually endogenous. They're being produced within the body naturally. LSD is the least toxic thing known to man. You know that? It requires the smallest amount to be effective of any known compound on the planet. You can take the same amount of plutonium and it'll pass through your body and do nothing to you, or cyanide. LSD is the least toxic thing known to man. The fact, psychedelics are non-toxic and non-addictive. As Terence McKenna says, all they do is give you funny ideas. Why are they illegal? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. And we were talking about this morning. It's like the main hysteria that's still used to this day by parents all over the planet is, if you take LSD, you'll be like that girl that jumped off the bridge. And yes, in the 60s, there was a girl who took LSD, who was already mentally disturbed, who shouldn't have been given the acid in the first place, and she committed suicide by jumping off a bridge. We have one documented account of this happening. I am curious how many people have jumped off bridges in alcohol in the last 40 years. Thousands. Hundreds of thousands. How much domestic violence, how many suicides, how many murders are alcohol related? That is a statistic they do not give us. But it's high. Tells you something. So our body's really telling us the compounds that are good for us and the compounds that are bad for us. And I think we can use these as a guidelines for our own education. Now, once again, this question is why? Well, I think the alternative at the moment to a change to a psychedelic perspective in our society is mass destruction. This is Alex Gray's first psychedelically inspired painting. He had an acid vision of this, a thermonuclear Jesus. It took him 3 years for he had the courage to paint it. Robert Venosa, who's the other great visionary artist of this period, his first psychedelically inspired painting was an atomic Jesus also. Alex is a Jew. To him, he says Jesus is the suffering of man. Now, what's interesting to me is the relationship between atomic energy and psychedelics. Röntgen discovered radiation the same year that Hefner isolated mescaline. Spath first synthesized mescaline, which was the first synthesis of a psychedelic in 1913 between the two great wars in Europe. And then Albert Hofmann had his premonition to reinvestigate LSD-25 within months of the Manhattan Project. To me, these two things are not accidents. If you were to ask me what's the most egotistical invention on the planet, it's the atomic bomb. Or they got way worse than those now, but the idea that one human being has the right to push a button that then takes the lives of millions is an ego that's gotten out of control. And really, people shouldn't be allowed to be world leaders without going through psychedelic introductions, you would think. So, but I really find, this, when I first had my awakening on 5-MeO, I used to talk a lot about God. And I was a hardcore atheist before I smoked 5-MeO DMT. And I realized after a while that God's a word that's just so confrontational for a lot of people, it stops people listening. So I've slowly started to use terms like source, not ketchup, but source. And I relate a lot to the ego. I really like Eckhart Tolle's work because he took a non-denominational approach to all the different things, and he's outlaid it in a way that helps you understand. But for me, there was kind of a breakthrough, this recognition that the ego is this thing that we think is running the ship, but it's just a little part. And if you can ever have that experience of breaking away from the ego and seeing that there's more to it, feeling this sort of underlying consciousness, that's a step towards reintegration. And I think that's what everybody here is, even unconsciously, looking for that moment outside of space and time when you're suddenly like, oh, I am a part of something else. You feel the transpersonal, you feel the connectiveness of everything, and you realize that our actions really do affect each other. And I think the psychedelic perspective is the perspective that's going to save the planet at the moment. I think one of the great things that came out of the first psychedelic revolution of the 60s was the environmental movement. 20 million people hugging trees led to a very new, the environmental movement was a completely new thing. And I think that's a big part of what's going on now. Now, the next question is this the second psychedelic revolution, or are we actually the part of what I think is going to be the fifth great psychedelic culture? Because another thing that's going on in modern sciences and anthropology at the moment is we're really only waking up to the fact, academically, what a massive influence psychedelics have had on human culture. Even 30 years ago in universities, it was scoffed. The idea that psychedelics had anything to do with the growth of human culture. But one of the results of the 60s and the 70s was a whole wave of anthropologists who came through college with a psychedelic perspective and then went out doing the field work and realized, well, hang on, psychedelics are actually everywhere and have been everywhere for a long time. And I honestly believe that the nexus of language and art and religion is the psychedelic nexus. It was probably the accidental ingestion of plant entheogens that kicked the cerebral stimulation that's led to human culture. So we now know for sure that there's been 4 great psychedelic cultures. Probably the greatest is the Vedic India, who had a drug called soma that we do not know what it is. We've never been able to actually figure it out. But it was so important that a third of the verses of the Vedanta are about this plant drug. It had a massive effect on Indian culture, and the Vedanta, which is what we would call Hinduism now, they say is the greatest investigation into consciousness in history. Lord Albert Whitehead said that. So they had thousands of years of psychedelic experimentation. For example, it's interesting to me, the yoginis and the meditators who go, oh, psychedelics are an impure form, and yoga and meditation is the pure form and it'll take you to this place. Well, I think that yoga came out of psychedelic use. Because I have noticed with 5-methoxy-DMT, people who've done no yoga in their lives get up and start doing perfect sun salutations and hitting all kinds of interesting poses. And I honestly believe there's a good possibility that soma use led to these ritualized movements that then developed to a whole school. Because pre-Samkhya dualism, the school that led to yoga and meditation, all these things, was a psychedelic culture. Soma was a part of that culture. So I think meditation and yoga were actually tools to help you in the psychedelic experience, and that they all integrate together. The next great culture we have is Chavin in Peru. How many people been to Peru? How many people been to Chavin? Chavin's an unknown spot, which I find kind of interesting. Everybody goes to Machu Picchu and down south. The real nexus of psychedelic culture in South America is this place called Chavin de Junta, which is on the backside of the Andes near Huaraz, and was actually a psychedelic temple and school. And it's surrounded by San Pedro cactus and ayahuasca. But you go to this place and it's so obvious that it has the big shaman fire amphitheater where they would brew, and then they would send you underground. There's all these crazy little tunnels, a super intricate system for air and shafts of light. And in the middle, you burst into this chamber, and there's this 17-foot high rock carving of this god called the Lanzon that looks like something Luke Brown would do. And Chavin conquered without war. They would bring the leaders and the shamans from other tribes to Chavin, and they would set them through the complex, and when they came out the other side, they just signed up. All over. And the Chavins are the ones that they say created the architecture, and they're the first ones that created a notable Andean art style. So thousands of years later, the Inca were actually using Chavinian techniques. The use of mescaline cactus in Peru is at least 3,000 years old. If any of you remember back in the day Eric von Daniken's, the Food of the Gods guy, who was one of the first, the gods were aliens, one of his most famous carvings of the guy that looks like he's sitting in a spaceship, that's from Chavin. There's another thing I found very interesting. All the cultures that I'm going to mention are the main cultures that invented rock carving. I think there's an interesting relationship between psychedelics and sculpture. I haven't been able to figure out exactly what it is, but... So the next one you have is the Olmec, the Toltec, the Maya, and the Aztec in Mexico. Mexico has more kinds of psychedelics than anywhere on the planet, and these cultures used a huge variety of them, including peyote, lilaquai, which is morning glory seeds, which have like LSD-type compounds, and some kind of toad venom that may well have been 5-methoxy-DMT. And then we have the one that's most interesting to our own culture, which is ancient Greece, Eleusis. The Eleusinian mysteries ran for 2,000 years. Just think about that for a second. The idea of anything that could run for 2,000 years in this day and age is just mind-boggling. Imagine boom in 2,000 years. Right? I mean, it might happen. Yeah. It's just when I just think about it blows my mind. You could only do it once. That was one of the interesting things about the Eleusinian mysteries. When the Romans arrived in Greece, the only paved road was to Eleusis. And you did a pilgrimage to get there. It was a 2-week-long thing. And there was a series of performances. You were given this drink called Kikion, which we think was probably an ergotized grain potion, which created an LSD kind of compound. Demeter was the goddess of wheat. Those are those that know the Greek legend of Demeter and Persephone. Her daughter was taken by Hades to the underworld, and then Demeter's the mother, and she goes back to bring Persephone back to the above world. But she takes a bite on something. She's not allowed to eat when she's there, and the daughter eats a seed or something, so that's why she has to go back to the underworld for 4 months a year, which creates winter. That's the ancient myth of the seasons. But it's interesting, if you look at the myth from a more psychedelic perspective, it's also the classic tale of a shamanic death and rebirth. This idea of dying and then coming back, which is a common theme throughout shamanism, this idea that we die to be born again. And this is this ego death that I keep talking about, the death of the idea of the I and the realization that there is another much greater force underneath it all. So then I propose that we're actually now on the verge of the 5th great psychedelic culture. That began in 1885 when Hefner isolated mescaline from cactus. People don't know much about Hefner, but he was the first psychonaut. there was a number of chemists trying to find out which alkaloid was active in the cactus, and he figured it out first by testing them on himself. And then in 1913 we made the big break, which was the first synthesis of a psychedelic compound, which was mescaline, which is, the most historic break we've made. And then the next one was, of course, a few years later, the introduction of, or the invention of LSD. Now, there's a lot of talk about that plant medicines are superior to synthetics. I personally don't agree with that. But I think the interesting thing about LSD and its arrival was there's never been a compound that could affect so many people so easily. A competent chemist can make 3 million hits of LSD in an afternoon. So you would have never got that many plant medicines to be distributed in the 60s to have had that sort of societal boost that's now led a lot of people back to plant medicines. And people also say that LSD is a synthetic. It's not entirely true. We found compounds extremely similar to LSD in nature. They're just very complex, so they were hard to find. So at the time that LSD was synthesized, it didn't have a known analog. We've now found a lot of very similar analogs. So LSD does have its analogs in nature. So the most practical uses of entheogens, as a summary: for examining and experiencing differentiated states of consciousness, for examining the action and purpose of consciousness itself, for realizing the existence of ego and experiencing the field of universal consciousness without it, for experiencing the transpersonal nature of reality that is the common ground of all mystical experiences. I think the mystical experience, no matter how you come to it, is pretty much the same. For realizing our common connection with Source, and I threw this in for Boom, and of course for dancing. Thank you, Boom. Yeah. This was the, where'd it go? This was the liminal drop, and last time I spoke, beautiful structure by Gerard, who now did the Chill Zone, and that's my book. So I have a new book coming out, Second Psychedelic Revolution. I also have a book of short stories coming out called Who's Got the Bomb? This one's easy to find. That's my information website, and now I'll take some questions.
Thank you for another fascinating talk. I also want to thank you for putting me in touch with Rick Doblin, and I got my uncle help with his PTSD. He got ketamine treatment, which incidentally is 60% as effective at 60% success rate. MDMA is 82% success rate. Now to the question. I never spoke to anyone about this until I met Peter Fennick at the Science of Consciousness conference in April, and he researches near-death experience at King's College. And basically 8 years ago, I had a near-death experience in India when I had really bad dysentery, and I was super dehydrated, and I kept blacking out every time I tried to get up. One time I blacked out and I went into a whiteout, and for several hours it was like devoid of any material form. I couldn't feel anything, I couldn't see anything, and there was just an intense white light that seemed to like permeate everything and had no particular source. Like, it came from within me and everywhere. And it lasted several hours, and I was convinced I was going to die, and I was like hanging on to life by a very thin thread, and breathing was like as difficult as doing a handstand. And I came out of that, and it lasted several hours, and then later that year I tried 5-MeO-DMT for the first time, and it took me to the exact same place, but that was an actual death experience. I wasn't hanging on to life, I was dead as far as I was convinced. And I've got to that same place several other times on ayahuasca, DMT, even just chanting in the Hare Krishna temple a couple of times. And I met Dennis McKenna a couple of months ago, and I told him about that experience, and he put me on to Eddie Fresca, who is, I don't know if you've heard of Eddie Fresca. He's a Hungarian...
Is there a question in this?
Yeah, he's a Hungarian... Okay,
he does this to me all the time.
Sorry. He's a Hungarian psychiatrist, and he believes that the role of DMT, endogenous DMT, is to protect the brain from brain damage in oxidative stress, and I'm pretty convinced, based on my experience, that's what happened to me. And I had like an endogenous explosion of DMT or 5-MeO-DMT, without which I would probably be brain damaged or dead. Does that agree with possibly your own?
I think once you have an experience on any kind of compound or whatever, the brain hardwires itself to that experience. So once you've created neuronal pathways that know how to snap into a certain configuration, they will try and snap back into that configuration if they can. My first true transpersonal experience was on 5-methoxy. Since then, I've had the same experience on DMT and on LSD, which previously would have never been able to take me to that place. But I think because the neurons in my brain now had to snap into that state of extreme coherence, that it, that's the idea of years and years and years of meditation, is you create these neuronal pathways that slowly you get to this place. That question is probably better suited to my Tryptamine Palace presentation, since we haven't gone into a lot of that material. But yeah, I think anything once you've reached a certain state, your brain has a tendency to try and get back to that state. One of the interesting things with this idea of resonance is a more coherent source will make less coherent sources try and pull themselves into coherence. So I've had this experience where I've gone to great teachers, Rinpoches and things, and I've got this burning question I really want to ask this Rinpoche, and I'll be in India and I'll traipse up and I'll wait to see him, and I'll get in and I'll be like, oh, I got nothing to ask you. And I'll just sit there for a while, and then I'll leave and I'll be walking back to the village, and I'll be like, oh, why didn't I ask him that question I had? Because I think there's a part of you that when you're when you're actually in the presence of a true great teacher, your own coherence wants to be more coherent. That would be my explanation. So, once your brain's reached that state, it's going to be able to get back to that state. I don't know about that it's a protective thing necessarily. That's an interesting theory. Next, we're going to go with the mics, I believe. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. And I hope you don't mind asking about the iconic figure of Terence McKenna and your personal take on the contradiction about the public persona and the private persona, that he went through a depression, and there are some voices that said that he didn't take
drugs. Yeah,
10 years.
I know. I never met Terence. I came into the scene shortly after Terence died. Dennis and I have become reasonably good friends, and Terence's son Flynn and I have become reasonably good friends, and they have quite contradictory stories on that. Dennis and Terence were fairly estranged for a long time, and I think Dennis is the one that a lot of this information's come from, that Terence stopped taking drugs. His son certainly says that's not true. I don't know. I think Terence felt a little trapped towards the end, that this persona had been created and he had a whole life built up around it. It wasn't necessarily what he wanted to do. I think a lot of times we're dealing with work that we did years ago, and we want to move on to the new thing, but everybody wants to know about the old thing. So it's I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. There was a lot of things that went on in Terence's underground life that people know less about, for sure.
Hi there, James. Thanks for your talk and your work. And I wanted to ask, you mentioned, you just touched on the idea that there were mistakes made in the 60s or in the first psychedelic revolution, and even the fact that you're talking about a second psychedelic revolution that we're experiencing and part of, it does indicate that there's kind of a disjuncture there.
Yeah, that's something I really forgot to get into. I think what we learned in the 60s is we didn't have a container for the experience. We suddenly had the tools, but we had no background knowledge, no container. We didn't really know about the mystery schools. We didn't know about shamanism. There was so many. We didn't even know that there's a psychedelic perspective to humanity. So I think if we're 50 years on, we now, to me, Boom's a classic attempt at creating a viable modern mystery school, like an environment to allow transcendence to occur. It's not quite as pointed as Eleusius, but I think that's what we're trying to do, is create safe containers to allow for experimentation with psychedelics so people don't get harmed. The classic example is the dosage of LSD. You know, in the 60s, it was 250 to 350 mics a dose, and if the first time they gave you 2, you know, if you wanted to see Larry's white light. If I gave anybody in my community 600 mics for their first time, most of my community would be down on me saying that I was being irresponsible. Whereas back then, that was standard operating procedure. So we've learned that much, you know, and I still think 600 mics of LSD is a very useful experience, but it just needs to be in the right environment. A dance floor is not the environment. I find the whole ayahuasca thing kind of amusing because people are now willing to go to the jungle to puke and do everything else to feel like they're getting this experience that is also you can get from 600 mics of LSD in the right environment, I think. I know people argue with me that it's not the same, but a lot of the same information comes through. I think there's something about the shaman and the whole experience of going there that gives people a sense of validity, which if that's what they need, that's fine. But I think we could create that same sense of validity in a contemporary modern structure if we were allowed to. That's the biggest problem is generally we're not allowed to work on building these and that's one of the things that makes Boom so important. The Portuguese laws, cosmic care, testing caravans, these are a big step forward in psychedelic culture for like the overall thing. Safety is the main thing. You just don't want people getting hurt and messed up.
Thanks for your talk. It's been really insightful. I was just wondering how you could plan that we could get more psychedelic drugs more accessible to everyone, and to how the stigma of psychedelic drugs could
Well, I
be
think
dropped.
the stigma's falling away, but it's interesting when you're in this culture, you think it's a lot bigger than it is. There was a great conversation last night with, I think somebody was in the audience. Her youngest sister was the one who first started doing acid, and her other sister were like, oh no, you're going to ruin your life. And their mom was all worked up about it, and they're from California, you know. And then they realized, oh no, actually it's all fine, you know, and now she's here working for the DoLab. But I think there's a lot of that. I mean, the stigma from the 60s is still going on, and an interesting thing I read, the DEA think there's only been something like a dozen great LSD chemists in history. But it's that difficult to make, and it's that difficult to actually get the precursors. There's been that few people have been responsible. I find that statistic amazing if it's true. You know, I don't have a lot of first-hand. The fact that psychedelic culture even rebooted itself is quite remarkable, because they gave a good go at getting rid of it, and it's not going away. And what we're seeing, you know, with this festival culture that's arising in the 21st century is this is the container that's allowing psychedelic culture to expand and hopefully spread out into the rest of society. So I'm going to be around here all week. If you didn't get a chance to ask me a question, please feel free to come up to me if you see me. My mates call me Rock, do the same. Once again, thanks all for coming. This has been a great experience.
Thank you very much, James.